Hi everyone, in today's video we are talking about gapless audio loops for your attraction or event. Why would we want gapless, unending audio loops for these events? Well, we want them because we want every guest to have the same quality experience whether they entered the attraction 10 minutes earlier or 10 minutes later. The problem with this is that most media is not built to be looped endlessly without any distinguishable starting point or ending point. And not all media players can play back audio without a small blip of silence when the track loops back around, which you'll notice in a lot of lower end MP3 players and stuff like that. To walk through this issue, first we have to understand a little bit about the technology that will be playing these tracks back. An advanced audio system like QSYS can play a short wave file in a constant loop without gaps indefinitely for hours and hours or days and days, while a low-end MP3 player might struggle to play a short MP3 without a noticeable gap in playback when the file restarts from the top. From what I understand, this is a result of MP3 storing metadata in the lead and end of the file. Some MP3 players know to disregard this silence at the top of the file, but others won't, and will have a small but noticeable gap in the playback of the track. So for example, this wave file, if I zoom in real close, this is an MP3 export of that same wave file above it. And you can see that there is silence inserted into the top of the file and silence inserted into the end of the file. So this has been exported from Pro Tools, and it tags that silence onto the front and back. And when we play this back, you're going to hear a small little blip of silence when that loop would come back around. So you don't want your guests to hear that little gap right there. And because of that, we want to render these files in a way that would prevent that from happening. And in this video, I'm going to show you the best practices for how to do that. There are a bunch of ways to do this, but these are just a few nice tips and tricks to get you started. So let's start with this drone file that I have here. So it's a good drone for suspenseful or scary attraction, but we can see at the top of the file and at the end of the file, we have a fade in and a fade out. So we can't just throw that file on a player and loop it all night because it'll constantly be turning down and up after 2 minutes. So traditionally, the way that I would loop this or create the looping file is first I would find a 0 point in this waveform right in the middle. So right about here, I can make this slice. I can now drag the front half of this file over the back half and center where the files lay over the top of each other and create a nice little crossfade. Equal out the volume for that. Now that crossfade should allow our file, because it's a non-musical drone, it should allow our file to easily lay on top of itself to make that transition clean. Let's take a listen to what that sounds like. So that crossfade works really well. So what we need to do now is to consolidate these two halves into a single file. So now if I duplicate this and I zoom in at what is now the start and end of the file, you can see it's a really nice clean join of the two files. And if we listen to that transition, you can hear that that's seamless with no gap in between when the file loops back around to the top. In the case of a nicer system, a more professional system like QSYS or an MP3 player or Wave player that can do gapless playback, we could export one of these files, which is about 1 minute and 40 seconds long, give that, load that onto the player, and just hit play, and it'll run all night, right? But what if we can't afford a nicer system, or we just don't have access to one and we need to use a lower cost playback system? What I would do in that case is I would render this out a bunch. Let's say I would make it, 3 or 4 hours long if I have the space on the player. And I would consolidate all those perfect loops into one long track. And then what I would do is add a little bit of a fade in and a little bit of a fade out. And the reason we're doing this is when I deliver this file, or we load it onto the player, instead of guests hearing a fade in and a fade out every 2 or 3 minutes, now only the guests who are in the attraction at that 2 or 3 hour mark when this file ends will hear that kind of fade out and fade in, and they might not even notice it depending on how well I can mask that fade in and fade out into the track. The idea being when the loop comes around, you want as few people to hear it as possible throughout the night, and you want to make it as unnoticeable as possible. So with a drone like this, as you can see, it's relatively easy. You can slice it in half, fold the two halves over the top of each other, and then render that out, or create a longer loop and render that out for a playback system that can't support gapless playback. Now let's take a listen to the same thing, but with a drum loop. So I've switched our counter to beats per minute, and the reason that we did that is that I know the BPM for this drum loop. And if you know the BPM for your drum loop, it makes this type of editing really easy. You can see that the beats fall on our markers here in our grid. So if I wanted to just grab a 4-bar loop, I could grab that and render that out, and that can be my loop that plays indefinitely. But I do want to keep this ending, so we're going to pull that away and drag it over here for later. Let's take a listen to what this drum loop sounds like at this loop point right at the center of this waveform. So that file could be exported and, again, just looped all night if we wanted. But again, if we're in a situation where we don't have a playback system that supports that, we could create a super long loop of this, and because we kept the ending of our track, we have a nice smooth ending for our loop to come around on. So if we were using a system that didn't support that gapless playback, this is what the guests would hear. So that works. It's not too noticeable because it's the actual top of the file. It starts on the 1 beat, so you would just let that play all night, and only the guests that were around every couple hours, however long you rendered that file, would hear that ending. And even with that ending, it's still smooth enough to support what the attraction would require. Now let's look at what we would do in the case of using an actual song. Songs can prove to be the most difficult to do for this type of never-ending loop. I have a song chosen here that we can use that's kind of a suspenseful, good background music track for a haunted attraction or something like that. Let's take a listen to what this track sounds like so you can hear what we're working with. And you'll notice that this file has this sort of fade out here, and then it has a big impact at the end. So we're going to use that to our advantage later on here. Now, with a music track, usually what I'll do is create another stereo track. And this is going to be our BGM loop 2. And we're going to copy the original file down to this track. And because we have this nice impact at the end of our file, that helps us give us a point to hide the loop point of our song. So you can see I'm lining the first drum hit of the track under this transient from the end. We'll fade that in right under that transient, and let's listen to what that transition sounds like. So that's really smooth. So now what I need to do is basically pull this into a single file, so it's not two files playing simultaneously. To do so, we're going to use a stereo aux, and I'm going to route these two tracks down bus 1 and 2. I'm going to set my input of my aux to bus 1 and 2, and let's make sure that we're getting signal to our aux here. Perfect. So we need to commit the audio from this aux down to a new track. So we can hide our BGM loops now, or at least shrink them down. And let's expand our new version of our song loop. Okay, so we have two versions of this track playing one right after the other. And you can see this is the first one, and this is the second one, and this is our transition. So we need a point to basically start this song over, but to contain our transition. And there's a really nice point in the track right here where we can see this transient that we can use as kind of our point of alignment. So I'm going to grab this 0 point right at the top of this transient, and I'm going to find the same exact 0 point from when the track repeats over here. There's our 0 point right there. Now I'm going to stash this additional ending point off to the side for now. And this right here, this is our loop. If I was to render that out and play it back on a playback system, this is what it would sound like. So nobody would hear that loop start over right there, and that track would just play indefinitely forever. But again, if we're on a system that doesn't support that, how do we deal with that? Well, the easiest way to handle that is to keep that nice ending, which we've stashed over here, duplicate this for several hours, like we've talked about in earlier parts of this video. And what we're going to do is leave the original ending with that nice impact and fade out. So now you have this long file. We'll pretend that this is a couple hours long. And it's going to loop and loop and loop, and nobody will hear any gaps until it gets to the very end. And what that ending is going to sound like is the original track ending leading into the original track intro. And this is what that sounds like. Sounds pretty good. So if somebody was in the attraction at that time, they would hear that fade out, but they would never know that that's a point that you're allowing your player to come back and loop around. And that's it. Some quick and easy ways to create never-ending loops for your attraction. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe. You'll find more demos, reviews, and tips and tricks for attraction sound design. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comments. Thanks again.